Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you all very much for being here. This is the Climate Lab of the New York Historical Society. The Climate Lab is a project of the New Amsterdam Project, which is something I started last year to bring New York Historical's attention to its Dutch period, when New York was New Amsterdam, and especially to focus on themes from that early period in New York's history that are particularly relevant to us today, of which I identify three. Toleration, as it was called back in the day, so the foundation of a pluralistic society. Capitalism, because while the Dutch were founding in New Amsterdam, they were also creating the building blocks of capitalism. And water. The Dutch at the time were pioneers of water management, and that is terribly relevant in the world today and in New York today, and hence the Climate Lab, and hence all of you being here. Thank you for being here, and Saad, thank you so much for being here. This is about the 8th or 9th iteration that we've done. You were at the first one, right?
I was at the first one.
The first one was with Alex Halliday,
Yes.
who's the dean of Columbia's climate school. And so I'm really glad to have you here. I was going to, compose a little bio introduction for Saad, and then on the site of the city parks, they had this. I could not top this, so I'm just going to read you their bio. Okay. Saad Amer is an environmentalist, a climate justice activist, and the co-founder of Plus One Vote, which we are going to be talking about in a moment. He has worked with Al Gore, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Taylor Swift. He is a consultant to the United Nations. As an advisor to the National Parks Conservation Association, he helped secure $6.5 billion in funding for the national parks. He has researched the impacts of climate change on the ground in the Indian Himalayas with USAID, co-created Harvard University's inaugural sustainability plan, and discovered a new hybrid species in French Polynesia. This is beginning to sound a little bit like George Santos. You really did these things, right?
Let's not get into my drag career.
Please welcome Saad Amer.
Thank you.
Saad, I have one main question that I want to ask you, which is kind of a silly question, but a lot of people want to do things about climate change. And probably a lot of people here are doing things. But there's a difference between, the way most people grasp and try to move forward on things. And you seem to be able to do things on a much bigger front and to really get things done. Do you have what's your secret?
I spend all my time doing this.
Okay.
I think for me, I think about the climate crisis as a sort of systemic thing, right? It impacts every single sector. So it impacts policy, it impacts social justice, it impacts our economy, it impacts our jobs, it impacts our water, our air. It touches every single aspect of society. And for that reason, there are ways to impact it through every one of those sectors. So whether you are a lawyer or a historian or an accountant or an artist, there is something that you can do to make an impact on the climate crisis. And so for me, as I've gone through my career, I've sort of had an open mind and tried to bring in people from all of these different sectors and trying to understand, well, what can we do? What can we do through our government? What can we do through our businesses? What can we do through social organizing? What can we do through the arts? And in doing that, it's allowed me to broaden my perspective and also help work with a larger coalition, a larger movement of folks on the ground who are all doing incredible things, but when we come together, we are significantly more powerful. So it's been something that's been a learning process, but it is something that we are all a part of actively.
So I think that a lot of people feel this is such a, this is a problem that is so big, so vast, it's overwhelming, so there's this inclination to say, well, I'm just not going to do anything. That's maybe my inclination. But what you're saying is you can break it down into all these things that it touches and just pick one of those and start working on it.
Absolutely. I mean, I started my journey as a freshman in high school and worked with my school to create a 100-acre land preserve called the Fish Thicket Land Preserve out on Long Island. And it's still there to this day. If you want a tour, let me know. We can hang out. But that was something that I was able to do as a student and create a student group around it and try and put together the resources that I had access to be able to actually create this and create programs around it. And I think that's something that we all have the ability to do. I think when we focus so much on what can I do, we tend to fall into recycling or plastic straws and small things like that. And those steps matter, but when we all come together and we start talking to our communities and we start actually organizing and building something larger than just ourselves, then you really start to see the impact scale. In the same way that the climate crisis itself is the result of a series of systemic issues, right? It's not just, oh, one person is driving their car or one building is releasing these emissions. It is a whole world of billions of people all doing these activities. So if we want to fight that, we need billions of people to come in and take the actions that actually reduce our emissions, that improve our water quality, that protect our environment.
So you started Plus One Vote to organize people who have been out of the process to come into the process and vote. One thing I think that it's challenging about climate when it comes to voting is it's not as simple as, here are two candidates. This one is for dealing with climate change and that one's against or something. I mean, there's, how do you, it's so, the problem breaks down in so many ways. There's so many different debates about which are the best technologies to support things like that. So maybe you can just talk about that project and how it came to be and what it's doing now.
Yeah, so I started Plus One Vote in 2018, ahead of the midterm elections, sort of under the guise of the last administration, where we saw hundreds of rollbacks on major environmental policies, and a lot of issues in the social justice sphere. We all lived in this realm, in this era, yeah, I'm sure you all remember. And I noticed that there was a lack of action from the climate movement, and there was a lack of organizing spaces that really centered young people and people of color.
So, you mean kind of garnered outrage and said, no, we have to move forward, not backward, kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, it was the sort of thing where we could just sit and watch this all happen and watch our rights be taken from us, or we could come together and organize and do something more powerful. And so the concept with Plus One Vote was, who's your plus one? Who's the one person that you're gonna register to vote? The one person that you're gonna bring with you to the polls? And in that way, it takes you beyond just your own individual vote. It starts scaling to the people around you. And then you can build an entire community of people all around you. And we were able to create a sort of a series of voting rights activists all across this country doing this in their communities, in their schools, online, wherever they were, and really able to mobilize people to talk about the issues that they were passionate about, whether that was climate change or social justice or voting rights or whatever it was that they cared about. And in that way, when we all show up to the polls, we can all collectively have this massive impact and fundamentally change who's representing us in office.
All right, and I can, you can have an idea like that. What if if you get everyone who votes to find one other person? But can you take us through the steps to organizing something like that? You have to get funding, you have to build a brand. How did you go about doing that?
Yeah, I mean, when I started this in 2018 with one of my friends, and we were kind of like, okay, let's talk to our friends. Like, the way it kind of started for me was I was talking to one of my friends who's like super smart person, always posting this really smart woke stuff online, and like very well educated. I really respected her until I found out that she didn't vote. She was living abroad. She never heard of an absentee ballot. And so I was like, oh, if you're not voting, like you, someone who I respect, then what does that mean for everybody else, And so that was one of the first people that I just took steps to register to vote. And then started doing that with my other friends. And then I was like, well, what if other people just started doing this, So then I had I was talking to my friend. We were like, okay, let's turn this into a whole thing. And then we sort of created a series of campaigns around it. And the first one went super viral. You know, it was about the concept of who's your plus one. And online, it lent itself really well to spaces like Twitter, where people could just tag somebody. And then they'd be like, oh, this is kind of cool. Let me tag somebody else. So it was, you know, we had the actress Alyssa Milano, she made a video, and then she tagged who was then the mayor of LA, Eric Garcetti, and then he tagged Jimmy Kimmel, and it just kept on going. And then that really blew up, and then it was like, okay, we're clearly on to something. Something like this is missing. Let's keep going. And so we kept building that out and really bringing in all these different movements. The next campaign that we did was focusing on women's rights, and we were working with the Women's March. You know, and then in 2018, there was a record number of women who ended up being elected into office, the most at that point that we had ever had in history. And fortunately, every consecutive election, we've had a continuous record number of women, an increasing number of women in office. And it's something that we're not free unless we're all free, you know, whether it's women's rights or the lives of African Americans or indigenous communities. Unless we're fighting for all these communities, we won't be able to move forward. And the same is true with regard to the climate crisis, because it's an intersectional issue. It's an environmental justice issue. So the thought process was, let's get all these communities involved, and the more we did that, and the more we created that space for people to use these advocacy tools and platforms, the more people actually did it. Which, by the way, if you're not registered to vote, you can go right now to vote.org. It'll take you less than 2 minutes. You can do it right now.
Okay, so I just want to push a little further on this, because I think this gets at the heart of organizing and actually moving forward with something. You know, people have good ideas, but how to implement it. So being particularly savvy with social media, that's one tool that you have at your disposal. And then once it blew up, how did you capture it or shift it around? I mean, did you hire people and you had an organization, or was it two of you sitting in your apartment, or what?
I mean, in the beginning, it was us, and then we brought in some friends, some other advisors, some other organizers, and people were just kind of volunteering their time of like, oh, I have this idea, maybe I can do this, or oh, I can write these things, or oh, I know these people, let me bring them into the conversation. And we were really able to very quickly create a community, especially it was in the kind of 2 months leading up to the midterm elections in 2018. And part of why it worked was at that time, and in some ways now as well, there's such a vacuum in people organizing. I think a lot of people work with the assumption of, oh, there's people out there, there's people on the ground doing this, like, you know, I've seen someone with a clipboard on the side of the street, you know, but did you talk to that person? Have you ever been that person? You know, and when you have that experience of kind of being on the ground and organizing, you realize, oh goodness, we need more people. We need more people organizing this. We need more people leading in their own communities. And so that kind of just grew. And, you know, after those midterm elections, we sort of sat down and were like, okay, how do we really turn this into something? And we knew we were running into the 2020 elections, which of course there was going to be a lot more attention, a lot more resources, a lot more media, a lot more everything. How do we take advantage of all of these components and build it into something larger? And so we did, and continued to engage with a series of different organizations, influencers, leaders, and just kept on finding these different communities that needed more of these tools to be able to raise their voices in the ways that I think people really wanted to, especially in 2020. I mean, 2020 was a year of a lot of angst and anxiety and depression and coming to terms with the realities of the world we just sort of kicked under the rug and ignored. People were frustrated. They wanted things to do. And we were all cooped up at home because of the pandemic. And so we were able to capture a lot of that angst, and rather than sitting at home and being like, oh, this sucks, I hate the news, this is so boring, Twitter makes me depressed, taking that same energy and channeling it into something thought-provoking and something that it can be impactful, really helped sway the conversation and get a lot of people involved.
And it remains, plus one vote remains an amorphous thing? It's an idea, or do you have offices around the country, or you know?
So in 2020, plus one vote is formally or a registered 501c3, 501c4, or nonprofit organization. I took a step back in 2020 to focus more on my climate work, but yeah, it's still going strong.
So it was related to climate, but it was broad. It was just voting, period.
Yes, exactly. It was working across these different movements. For me, I went into it with the lens of a climate lens, because that's what my background is. That's what I know, that's what I understand, and that's where I could see that there were so many gaps in the climate movement. But the same reality of the gaps in the climate movement was true for so many other movements that, while they often spoke about policy or the need for larger systemic changes, they didn't necessarily take that to the voting booth. And so we were able to partner with all of these different movements to be able to do that. But for me, it kind of always came through this climate lens and thinking about themes of environmental justice and intersectionality, which I think is core to how we actually address the climate crisis.
Okay, so that brings us to your, I guess, the newly started organization, which is Justice Environment.
Yes.
So do you want to talk about that a little bit? So the logical connection is getting people to vote for these kinds of issues. And what is those two concepts, justice and environment, what happens when you combine them? What is your point?
So great question. So as I was, as we were going through 2020, I'm just like talking about my life now.
Well, I want to do that not just to make this a profile, but
yeah.
because you have captured this method, and it's like, I think a lot of people who are involved in this want to, could use those sorts of tips.
Totally. And so, I was thinking 2020, like the question that I'm constantly asking myself is, how can I have the biggest impact? What can I do with my specific set of skills, my specific resources, contacts, whatever, to actually do something? And in 2018, the answer was plus one vote. In 2020, the answer was still plus one vote. And going after the current administration was inaugurated, it made me reframe and rethink where we were. We had an insurrection, but we also had a lot more grassroots energy of people on the streets organizing. We had a lot of strife with the situation of COVID, but we also had a lot of major scientific breakthroughs and major policies that we were starting to see and are still starting to see in the environmental justice and climate space. And so I thought, okay, well, what I actually really know is climate policy and environmental justice. Now that there is a window and an opportunity of people in Congress, in the Senate, in the House of Representatives to do something, I should take advantage of that, and I should do as much as I can in that sphere. And so last year, I started Justice Environment, which is a social impact consultancy focusing on climate change and the just transition. And for those of you who are like, what's the just transition? Or maybe you're all climate people and you're like, I know what this is. But either way, right now we're in a really pivotal moment, right? The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the world's biggest climate entity, of which I was an expert reviewer, puts out a report every 5 years. And it's made incredibly clear that we need to halve our carbon emissions by 2030. It is literally 2023. We are nowhere on track to actually accomplishing that goal. And what that means is we are going to see a series of climate catastrophes all across the world. And we're already seeing those. What it also means is we have the opportunity to transition out of the way the world is right now in a manner that centers justice and to be able to improve the quality of life that people have. But it takes a proactive effort. And right now, we're starting to see a lot more recognition of the reality where we are with the climate crisis. We're seeing record investments from the US government through the Inflation Reduction Act, which we can get into if we want, and all these other policies, that we're in this window where we need businesses, we need governments, we need nonprofits, we need everybody to kind of come on board and all contribute our pieces and have big fundamental shifts in society. And so I started Justice Environment to do exactly that, to work with businesses, nonprofits, and governments, and push things along this journey so we can actually improve the world that we live in.
And it's a consultancy.
Yes.
So who are some of your clients, if you're at liberty to say?
Well, I think one client that I like talking about is I work a lot with the UN, the United Nations. And so I'm working right now with UN Women, which they have a campaign called the He for She campaign, which some of you may have heard of. He for She is the campaign of which Emma Watson was the face when she was in her feminist era. She's still in her feminist era, but and the whole notion of He for She is it's really about gender equality. So, you know, globally right now we have 90% of corporate boardrooms, 90% of elected officials are men. And so there's an active need for men to step aside, to make space, to embrace women and women's perspectives and center those narratives, but also allow them to lead. And so the concept of he for she is exactly that, to get men to advocate for women. And so, you know, I walk into this with, again, a very intersectional lens of, you know, one of the biggest solutions actually to the climate crisis is educating women globally about climate change. Because right now, with the lack and inequity of education that women are receiving globally, we have, I mean, if you're not educating half the population or you're forcing them to just stay at home and cook, you're preventing all of these brilliant minds from being able to actually go and take action. And so there's this intersection there that is really important that that's been a lot of fun to work on.
So can you explain what you're doing for them in particular?
Yeah, so for example, I started working with them last year in March for International Women's Month, which is just around the corner. International Women's Day is March 8th. And we were really understanding that, okay, there's this concept of the intersection between gender equality and sustainability, but do people know about that? Like, are we having those conversations? Is there that level of knowledge? And so we put together a campaign to specifically focus on that, got a bunch of global leaders from all around the world to work on this, whether they be policy experts or, you know, just your average climate girly on Instagram, to all come out and speak on behalf of this and to raise awareness, but also, you know, do it in a way that is sort of pressuring governments and corporations and larger institutions to institute a lot of these commitments to gender equality to push forward the need for better representation.
So again, is this mainly a kind of a social media campaign?
In part, but I think social media is an interesting thing because I think a lot of people will be like, oh, these youngins on the internet, like, what does this really do? But one, I think social media is fundamentally important because it is where all the major conversations start. It starts there, you know, maybe some reporters are checking it out, whatever, then it becomes a TV thing, and then it becomes a larger thing, but eventually it funnels into policy, it funnels into culture, it funnels into how we think about and see the world. And so it is in part that, but also in part policy and, you know, really getting into the brass tacks of what do we actually want people to commit to? What do we want people to actually do?
So it's a way, I mean, social media is a way to shape or shift the conversation, but it's not the only tool that you're working with, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Okay. And is it, so working for the UN, is that, you know, the UN is another one of those things that's this big amorphous, I mean, is there someone there who kind of picks up the phone, who you deal with, and things actually get done, or yeah. What's your experience been?
Yeah, I think, and I'm aware of a lot of critiques of the UN of like, they don't get anything done. What are they doing over there? Yeah. And I think in some ways I get it. You know, I think but I don't want to knock it for what it is. You know,
Yeah.
the UN is the only place, the only institution where we have all the countries around the world who've all bought in, literally, to come to a series of annual meetings on the biggest issues our world faces: climate change, poverty, gender equality, world hunger, lack of sanitation, energy, infrastructure, all of it. And all of these leaders from these countries are coming together to actively talk about this and to actively make commitments on these big issues. And so it serves as a really important fundamental structure that we have for how the world actually runs. And in many ways is why, not that the world has been at peace for the last several decades since the UN has been founded, but in many ways is why there hasn't been more violence. And so it is a crucial meeting place where a lot of things do happen. That being said, we look at climate change, we look at the COP process, the Conference of Parties, the annual big climate extravaganza that happens every year in November, December, and a lot of the commitments that we see come out of those conferences, while ambitious and lofty in nature, sometimes, most of the time, almost all the time, they are not actually resulting in reductions in carbon emissions, in improvements in our climate system. And so there's a real critique to be made about, what is the point of us all coming together and, on these private jets to have this big conference? The last one was in Egypt. The next one this year will be in Dubai. What is the point if even after all these commitments are made, the reductions don't happen? And so it sort of feeds back to the need for us, for like real people, to put pressure on our governments and our representatives to actually implement policy. Because I think when we have people on the streets organizing and pushing, you create the political reality and the political momentum for governments to then go and actually take action and implement policy on issues like climate change.
Let's talk about youth, young people. That when we were talking on the phone the other day, you were saying there more young people are organizing now than ever before, maybe, and that's always been an issue when it comes to voting. The younger vote is so much lower than older. If that's the case, that more young people are energized, and they of course should be, on climate change because it's going to affect them more, how is it manifesting itself? And is it manifesting itself in ways that are new?
Yeah, I mean, you think about the youth climate strikes that have been happening since 2019 with Greta Thunberg. There's really been this massive momentum of young people saying, hey, this is actually not acceptable. It's actually not okay to send me to school, teach me all this stuff, make me go to college, get infinite student debt, to then live in a world where I will never be able to afford a home, that even if I did, will be underwater, plagued by wildfires, in a world where there's food insecurity because we cannot get our agricultural system together. Eggs cost $1 million, and so there's a real strife and anxiety that young people are experiencing uniquely right now, because we can see it all happening. It's not like this new thing that we have to convince young people about. It's just the world that they're born into. And there's this idea that, well, this is unfair. And the Fridays for Future strikes have been so powerful because it's students literally saying, well, why should I go to school if you're teaching me things for a world that just actually won't exist? And so I think that momentum is really important. And it's continuing to grow and take different forms, in part because social media allows young people to sort of have this language and ability to connect with other people, but also because it is a real tangible thing that people can do. You can go into the streets, you can organize a protest, you can show your school board or your employer that this is actually important, we need to do something about it. And then when we have these types of conversations and bigger institutions buying in, it really does make a difference with how we are perceiving the issue and how we're actually taking action to address it.
Yeah. I want to invite all of you to ask any questions you like. And let me start, if you don't mind me putting you on the spot, Henk. Henk Ovink is here. He is the Dutch World Water Envoy, and we're going to feature him in a Climate Lab March 27th. Henk, do you have any specific question or overall reaction to Saad and what he represents?
Can I do it from here?
You can do it from there. I'll repeat it if people can't hear.
Okay. Thanks for your inspiring story. We were just also having a conversation that organizing around political momentum is more natural here in the US than in many other places around the world. I come from the Netherlands, we come from the Netherlands, and we are now here for this big UN conference. I lead on water in March. But I worked here closer against Sandy, and I felt myself in a very comfortable place when it comes to activism, organizing, really getting your hands around. And I hear a lot of that resonate in the things that you were able to do. I work in places where organizing is actually not actually influencing politics at all, in the global south, in Bangladesh, or and now in Myanmar, or in Afghanistan. So how can you relate your story to the stories you hear? You work at the UN, from the places around the world where organizing does not lead to capacity, does not lead to influence, where that might not feel so hopeful, and at the same time where there is still action and hope on the ground. I'm curious to hear their opinion.
I think everybody probably heard that, but he was comparing the U.S., saying it's actually a country where you can get a lot done, sort of with grassroots movements, and can Saad compare that to some other places where it might be more difficult?
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. The situation and realities that we face here are not at all what we are seeing in a lot of the rest of the world, right? We focus on the global south, and we can see how intensely climate change is impacting those communities already. I previously did research in India, and my family comes from Pakistan, and I'm sure you saw the floods last year, which impacted a third of the country underwater. And so there is a difference in the tools and the methods and the modes that one might use here in the US versus in certain countries in the global south. However, I would still push back on the notion that activism doesn't make a difference there. In many ways, it makes more of a difference in places like that. And I will also acknowledge the reality that as an activist, it's not an equal one-size solution everywhere. Being an activist in the US has a lot of privileges over the rest of the world because, for example, I don't necessarily feel like I'm going to die. Every other day for the last several years, an environmental activist somewhere in the world has been killed. And so that is a reality. It's not just like, oh, pick up a megaphone and go into the streets and start shouting. But when you really start to build these larger movements, you can grow larger conversations. Is it always safe? No. Is it always going to result in things immediately? No. But are things going to change if we don't speak up? Also, no. And so there is the need to understand what your own community is going for. It's why, for example, I don't say just take this solution, copy, paste it into whatever country you're from, go do it. Each country, each community even has its own set of experiences and challenges that need to be worked through for things to be effective. And it's important to not go in with a sort of Western mentality and say, hey, well, actually, I think you guys need this, and they're like, we need water, we don't need this thing that you're trying to sell us, we need energy, And so addressing those types of needs are also fundamental. And it's part of why we need these larger systemic policy changes. We need these larger multilateral institutions like the UN, but we still do need that same grassroots energy and momentum, because when those communities, there's a way to develop in the global south that keeps the system that we have right now. there's also a way to develop in a way that improves the way the world is, that leapfrogs over a lot of the dirty technologies that we currently have. And so it's important to work through that situation in each community and figure out what works.
Is there an overall different strategy that might work in the global south, that might work better because it's a different political system, because it's maybe more dangerous to do it the way you would do it here?
I think there's no one size fits all, but that's to say, like, if I'm saying to this largely American audience here in New York City, go vote, organize with your local community, talk to your city councilors, talk to the mayor, all these offices that we have here, federal policy, all of that, that's not going to work in North Korea, where it's a dictatorship and you don't get to vote. It's why it's necessary for all of these different places to figure out what works for what they have and the challenges that they face. And the way we think about it here in New York City is going to be very different than a community in sub-Saharan Africa that is facing desertification and they're unable to grow their crops, and there are swarms of locusts eating their farm yield from the last year, and now they're unable to actually eat. And resulting in a situation where by 2050, globally we will see at least 200,000 climate refugees. And that in itself is another one of these climate impacts that we need to think through as we continue to experience the reality of the climate crisis.
Other questions? Yes, ma'am. You want to go to this person first? Go ahead. She's asking, how do you fight against all the money that the big oil puts into maybe disinformation campaigns or banks? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. And one, thank you for the work that you do in organizing and sending those emails. It feels slow, and it probably feels awful. And I'm sorry you don't get to enjoy your retirement in the way that you may have previously envisioned. But thank you for the work that you do. It is really important. Money in politics is a big issue across the board, whether it's in climate or in tech or in any of these issues. And big oil is so deep in the pockets of kind of half our government. And it's unfortunate that through decisions like Citizens United and all these other things, where we see corporate companies privatized in a way that gives them even more power than already the vast influence they have over our economy. And so when we think about money in politics, the biggest way to fight it is actually through organizing. If you can go to a senator and be like, hey, I have 10,000 people in my community, we all say, screw this, I don't like this, that might sway their decision in another direction. In many ways, and this is unfortunate, but our politicians are guided by self-preservation. How do I get elected next? How do I get the most votes over the other candidate? How do I just get slightly enough over that 50% mark? 51%, even if the 49% of these people are pissed off and angry and underwater. And so it is important to put that pressure on politicians. And sometimes it can be hard, like you were mentioning earlier, once you get into the weeds of a lot of these decisions, which policy is better? Which set of solutions are gonna work? It becomes a much deeper conversation, and there are obviously experts in those fields, there is guidance out there, there are resources available, but continuing to organize and putting on that pressure really does make a difference. Even looking here locally in New York City with the climate policies that we've recently instituted, or, I remember as the climate strikes were starting, a lot of people were feeling kind of hopeless, like, what is the point of getting all these people in the streets? Nobody's listening to us. We're still seeing all these rollbacks on major federal policies. But eventually, with that continued pressure, many climate activists have started to get elected into office. We've seen many of them working in different congressional offices. We've seen activists like myself and some others lobbying in Congress to push some of these policies and actually getting elected officials to buy in to these fundamental changes in policy. And so it might take time, but eventually when you end up with something like the Inflation Reduction Act, which passed last year under this administration and doesn't solve all of the problems that we have. However, it does allocate $369 billion towards climate solutions, about $40 billion towards environmental justice solutions. Is it enough? No. Is it happening fast enough? No. But is it the biggest investment we've ever seen? Yes. And would it have happened without us all organizing in the streets? No. So it is one point of progress that we can point to where we can see that all these conversations were had, they materialized into real funding and real changes. And it's also not the end of the story, because there's still so much more that we have to do on exactly that. We need about $1 trillion in funding every single year to get us to where we actually need to be in fighting the climate crisis. So is this near that? No. But it is some semblance of a hope that at some level, us coming together and doing this can actually materialize into something that is, in my opinion, net good.
So your answer to her question is not anything really new. It's people have to be aware on the ground at the grassroots level of what the issues are, and to organize and to get the attention of their representatives.
Exactly.
So there just have to be maybe new ways or sexier ways or flashier ways to get people to mobilize.
Yeah, and the conversation has changed a lot in the last year from where it was 5 years ago. So you constantly need to update your tactics. You need to update how you're talking about these issues. The communities change as well, and the climate is changing too. So the ways in which we address this are constantly changing, and the things that resonate with people are going to change too. So you have to sort of be willing and open to changing how you speak about these issues, who you're speaking to. One major touch point that has become so central in the last several years is environmental justice. A lot of Black and brown communities were, of course, always talking about this, but it's become much more of a mainstream conversation in talking about how different communities are experiencing the reality of the climate crisis. And that, in many ways, is thanks to organizing.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Esther, and I'm from the School of Academia.
Oh.
One of my portfolios is program for secretary general, so that's why myself and friends here. My question to you is, you've seen the success of the youth movement engaging the national, sorry, maybe the federal level. What are the opportunities to engage the subnational government in the country of the United States? We have a decentralized government. What are the opportunities to mobilize and organize the subnationals that can actually support the entire United States around just transition, around emission cap reduction, not key things that the US will do for emission.
I didn't quite. I think with the fan, I couldn't quite hear the question. Did you understand? You're talking about levels other than the federal government organizing? Yes. At the state levels okay.
And you're talking specifically about youth?
Yes, in the US.
Okay, youth in the US. Yes. And so that's a great question, because I think it's something that, it's not like every young person represents the whole country. you have, youth are not a monolith. They come from different experiences, different perspectives. Talking to a young person here from New York is going to have a different experience from someone in Arkansas or California or whatever. And I think the biggest thing, especially within the UN system, is give them a seat, invite them in, let them into the conversation. I think there is a lot of, not just at the UN, but in other institutions too, a lot of youth washing or a lot of color washing where it's sort of like, oh, look, like we tweeted out a picture of this young person, hooray. It's like, well, you didn't actually change anything or have a conversation or take into account their perspective, But inviting them actually in to have those conversations is really important. And I think one very successful touch point is the Youth Climate Summit that happened in 2019. And so I was there. I had the opportunity to speak there. But in 2019, there was, every year there's a United Nations General Assembly. One of the biggest focuses that September was on climate action. And this is when you may have seen in the news when Greta came over on that boat. And that was like a big thing. So there was, this big climate person coming over on a boat. There was massive, the biggest climate strike ever in the US, in conjunction with young people from all across the country and all across the world invited into the space to have conversations at the Youth Climate Summit, and then also the proper climate summit where they had world leaders, prime ministers, presidents, etc. And I think when you have that level of engagement and representation, that can make a difference. In many ways, I think we give ambassadors and presidents and all these important people a seat at the table, but then consistently see them all sort of marginalize the needs of younger communities, and oftentimes not even understand the needs and realities of younger people. So there is a need to actively invite these people into these spaces. And I think the more local you get, the more disconnected it can feel to these larger institutions. But at the end of the day, when we talk about billions, trillions of dollars of funding and all these programs that are happening on climate change, it takes real people in cities and townships and villages and whatever to actually do something. And so there is a throughway and a connection to these larger systems that we live in, into our daily lives. But we have to take into account their perspectives to make sure that we're not just throwing money at the wall, and that the real needs of people are actually being addressed.
And do you yourself, are you working at the state level with particular, like with state legislatures in Arkansas or wherever? I mean, do you have experience doing that, or are you kind of focusing your efforts more broadly?
So, I've not worked in Arkansas, but, yeah, I think working with state institutions is super important. So, for example, New York recently passed automatic voter registration, which will, when it is implemented, allow people that, whenever you go to the DMV, whenever you update certain government programs, that you will automatically be registered to vote. And that alone, when it's implemented, maybe this year, who really knows? But it was already voted in, it just needs to be signed and officiated, implemented, will, in a year, register 2 million people to vote like that. And so, there is the ability for these states to sort of make a big difference, and for young people, young voices to get involved in those conversations to help push them forward. Because sometimes it just takes a little bit more to really push things in the directions that they need to go. But ultimately, that could lead to millions of people in New York being much more able to register to vote, than being able to vote in climate champions or social justice warriors or oil executives, whoever you're voting for. And that makes a difference in the policies that we ultimately receive and that are going to direct those funds into our daily lives.
And since you bring that up, it seems increasingly that we are becoming two different countries with two different, based on on accessibility to vote. I mean, there are states that are making it more difficult to vote and states that are making it easier to vote. So that, over time, how does that play? I guess you would counsel focusing attention on the places that are making it harder to vote so that those politicians have to answer for it.
Yeah, I mean, politicians should not be choosing who gets to vote for them, right? Like, that's just like not, that's not it. You know, and so there is a very active need for us to address issues of voter suppression. We have seen, you know, even in this country, we just had the 2-year anniversary of the insurrection, of the giant coup at the Capitol. You know, and so there are fundamental issues in our democracy itself. But at the same time, we need to make sure that we stay vigilant on those conversations as legislatures continue to introduce bills that do suppress votes. It becomes even more important to go out and vote. Does it become easier? No. Does it fair and like spread across all the communities? No. Does it disproportionately impact young people, people of color? Yes. It explicitly targets them to not vote in many places. And so there is an active need for us to stay vigilant and to make sure that those officials especially are ones who are representing our ideals.
Yeah. Go ahead. Is your question mainly to that you think it's the most important thing would be to focus your attention at the local level?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think when we talk about action on a local level, super important. You're absolutely right. I also think it's sort of multifaceted, right? So, like, yes, we do need building owners to reduce the imprints of their buildings, of their carbon emissions of their buildings. We do need to think about our use of methane and our addiction to it in our stoves and in our heating systems. You know, we've been taught that it is a transition fuel, but in many ways, I mean, not many ways, but that's just literally not true. And in many ways just bakes in very dirty infrastructure for the next several decades. So not transitioning out, in many ways emitting methane, which can be up to 80 times more warming than carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. And so there's a need to be vigilant on all of these things. At the same time, I think part of your question is talking about you know, people's frustrations in all of this. And like, yes, we do need to change hearts and minds, but I also acknowledge like change is not easy. There are people who love their gas stoves. There are people who love how warm their house is in the winter through, their oil or fireplace or whatever. And, and this is why the notion of a just transition is something that is so central, is it's a process. It's not just like one day there's no more cars. It's over time we need to rethink this system and slowly address, not slowly anymore, but quickly address these problems that actually get us towards reducing our numbers, reducing our carbon footprints, our emissions. But it is a thing that takes time. And it is a thing that we need action on an international, national, state, local, household, individual level. It's all of those things. And it can seem sort of overbearing, but like we're not all responsible for all of those things. We all have our different touch points, the different things that we're passionate about, the different things that we're plugged into. Some of us are writing letters to our local officials. Some of us are organizing on policy on the UN level. Some of us have a big voice in water policy. And all of those things are part of this larger conversation. And when you open your ears to what's happening at all of those other levels, I think it makes you more capable to address those issues at each of those levels. And if your power is, if you're like a senator or something and your power is federal policy, then having those conversations with the grassroots people who know, like day by day, individual to individual, what the issues are, then you are much more able to craft policy that can actually address those needs. But it's not like, oh, I'm just one person, I get a meeting with one of these important people and it's fixed. It's a thing that happens over time, and it is a thing that isn't easy. There are many obstacles to it. There is dirty fossil fuel money all in the system, but at the same time, there is our ability to get in there and use our people power and ensure that we are in these positions of power too, as representatives and as officials, to be able to then address this bottom up and top down.
One more question? Somebody? Yes, ma'am.
I just was curious, you've done a lot of conversation about governmental and how government can affect and how individuals can affect. But you haven't discussed the private sector, and in particular the BlackRocks and the Blackstones. And I'm just wondering if it's been your experience at all trying to get people to change their behavior, which certainly help make money off of something, which the BlackRocks and the Blackstones have been doing. So get away from the fossil fuel companies just for a minute. And I'm just wondering, in your opinion or in your experience, is that just window dressing on their part, or have you seen that actually turn into, if you start telling wealthy individuals these are great investments, that could certainly change certain people's behavior and their political donations. So I'm just wondering what your experience has been in the private, larger financial sector.
She's asking, a lot of this conversation has been about government. What about private sector and investment, directing individual investment money?
Yeah, and that's a really good point, because at the end of the day, 100 companies are responsible for 71% of emissions. And so the corporate sector is very culpable in the reality that we're facing right now. And right now, the way that we've structured our economy is it is profitable to destroy forests. It is profitable to use the sky as an open sewer. It is profitable to dump all your waste into the ocean. There's no repercussions. There's no negative feedback. You're able to just do that at liberty, at will, more or less, and make bank. Just walk away with a bag of cash. And our system should not be designed that way. It is the way our system is right now. And so when we look at the private sector, it is necessary for corporations to also make these similar changes in their emissions, in their uses of materials, in the human rights, in their supply chains. And on an implementation level, that is all crucial as well to reducing our emissions. If companies were going to do this because they're good people, we would have already seen that. right? In many ways, we do need policy change. We also need consumers to similarly raise a fuss about all of these issues and say, hey, I'm not going to shop here if you do that. I'm not going to want to work here if you're going to, continue to pollute, and raise attention to these issues as well. And so at the same time, as we continue to go through the climate crisis, because this is something we're actively in and living in right now, I think people's eyes are going to open up more and more. We're going to see people like Ellen with a river flooding her backyard, and not that Ellen is necessarily behind the climate crisis, but as we continue to see influential figures like that who see this in literally their backyard. I remember I was on a school field trip in Martha's Vineyard. This was years ago, and there's all these like big homes by all these like major executives of all these Fortune 500 companies, these like mansions, and we went to we were like driving around, and there was this one home of an airline executive, and it was right on the beach. Who doesn't love that view? However, due to rising sea levels, there was a very visible coastal erosion. And so you could see this person's lawn being eaten by the ocean, and like year by year was inching closer and closer to their home, and then like being a very real tangible impact on their physical investments, and on their personal real estate. And like, is the destruction of property a climate solution? Like, no, but it is going to open people's eyes as new markets emerge, as old markets become irrelevant, and as right now we're at a point where solar energy is in many ways cheaper to implement than coal, and that's a major step forward. So as we start to transition out of a very dirty energy and a much cleaner one becomes much more accessible, in some ways our markets are going to shift, and that in a way is a good market opportunity to shift the energy that we're using in our systems, and with more investments through things like the Inflation Reduction Act and other federal policies at a state level, and state policies as well, where you will see some of these systems change, but it also takes an active effort. So, I understand that I've like laid out a lot of problems for our government, for our businesses, for individual organizers and all that, but I think it is also an opportunity for us to all see this larger picture, and how we're all part of this larger picture, and how we're all living in this transition. And whether it is just or not is up to us, and in the way that we organize and pursue our own lives and take action in our communities every day. So take it as a call to action rather than a shock into anxiety. We all have the ability to do something about this. And if you have one takeaway from today, I hope it's that you think about what that is for you and how you can scale that to really being something meaningful.
And I was just going to ask you if there's one thing you would advise us to do to make a difference. Can you pick one thing?
Vote.
Okay. Vote or sign up somebody to vote.
Yes, vote, register someone else to vote, and think about your role in all of this. Not just as like a person who's like, oh no, I used a plastic straw, I killed a turtle, but as someone who also can organize in your community and make a fundamental difference, because just having conversations with people around you, you'll start to see sparks light up, and you'll start to see people really want to do something about their community.
Last question, what is this hybrid species that you identify?
So when I was in college, I was doing a lot of like evolutionary genetics research. I previously thought maybe I would address environmental issues from more of like an environmental like biology perspective. That obviously didn't happen. But I was doing research in French Polynesia, and as we were collecting our field samples, we happened to find a new hybrid fern species. And so, yeah, that exists now, and I can send you my paper about it.
That's wonderful. All right, Saad Amer, thank you very much. Thank you all for being here.